June 4th, 1942, 0534 hours, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The horizon stretched endless and empty, a pale seam stitching together the grey Pacific sky and the darker grey of restless water. The air tasted of salt and engine oil. Inside the cramped cockpit of a PBY Catalina flying boat, Ensign Jack Reed pressed his forehead against the cold plexiglass, scanning the emptiness below with eyes that burned from 12 hours of patrol. His gloved hand rested on the throttle. His co-pilot dozed intermittently in the seat beside him, head lolling with the rhythm of the twin engines. They had been flying grid patterns through the pre-dawn darkness for what felt like an eternity, searching for something everyone hoped they wouldn't find. Then, at 0534, Reed saw them. At first, it was just a smudge on the horizon, a dark irregularity against the uniformity of ocean and cloud. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The smudge remained. Then it grew. Shapes began to resolve themselves. The angular silhouettes of warships, dozens of them, moving in formation like a city of steel migrating across the sea. Reed's breath caught. His hand moved instinctively to the radio transmitter. His voice, when it came, was steady despite the hammering in his chest. Enemy carriers. Bearing 320, distance 180. Those 5 words would alter the course of the Pacific War. The PBY Catalina was never meant to be a weapon of war. It was a reconnaissance aircraft, a patrol bomber, a flying boat designed for endurance rather than speed, for observation rather than confrontation. Its crews called it the Dumbo, an affectionate nickname for an ungainly machine that looked more like a pelican than a predator. It was slow cruising at barely 110 miles per hour. It was cumbersome, requiring 2 pilots and a crew of up to 9 to operate effectively. It was vulnerable, armed with only a handful of defensive machine guns, and possessing neither the armor nor the agility to survive a determined fighter attack. In the hierarchy of American naval aviation, the Catalina occupied a modest, almost invisible position. Fighter pilots spoke of glory. Dive bomber crews spoke of precision. Torpedo squadrons spoke of courage. But PBY crews? They spoke of long hours, monotonous patrols, and the grinding tedium of searching empty ocean for enemies that rarely appeared. They were scouts, observers, the eyes of the fleet. Just a scout plane. But on that June morning in 1942, when the fate of the Pacific Theater balanced on the edge of a knife, it would be a scout plane, unglamorous, unarmed for offensive action, crewed by exhausted men flying a search pattern in the pre-dawn darkness that would deliver the most critical piece of intelligence in the entire Battle of Midway. And it would be scout planes, operating in the shadows of the more celebrated combat aircraft, that would prove again and again throughout the Pacific War that knowledge is a weapon as devastating as any bomb. The Japanese had not planned to be found. Their entire operational concept for the assault on Midway Atoll depended on surprise. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, had designed the Midway operation as a knockout blow, a decisive engagement that would draw out the remaining American carriers and annihilate them in a single climactic battle. The plan was intricate, almost baroque in its complexity. A diversionary strike on the Aleutian Islands to pull American attention north, followed by a massive carrier strike on Midway itself, with the combined fleet's overwhelming firepower positioned to crush any American response. Yamamoto had assembled the most powerful naval force Japan had ever put to sea. 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and a train of support vessels. Over 250 aircraft. The cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Aviation Corps, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, and the conquest of Southeast Asia. They expected to achieve complete tactical surprise. They expected to find Midway's defenses unprepared. They expected the American carriers, if they were even in the area, to stumble into the trap only after the island had been neutralized. What they did not expect was to be spotted by a lumbering patrol plane in the pre-dawn darkness, 240 miles from their target, with their strike aircraft still being armed and fueled on the carrier decks. Jack Reed's radio transmission crackled across the ether and reached the American task forces positioned northeast of Midway within minutes. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier Enterprise, received the contact report at 0603 hours. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, overall tactical commander aboard the Yorktown, confirmed the sighting at 0607. The information was precise: enemy location, bearing, composition. The Japanese carriers had been found. More importantly, they had been found early enough for the Americans to position their own strike groups, early enough to seize the initiative, early enough to turn Yamamoto's ambush into a trap of American design. The PBY Catalina had done its job. It had been the eyes of the fleet, and now, those eyes had given the fleet its prey. But Reed's patrol plane was not alone in the sky that morning. Across the vast operational area surrounding Midway, more than 24 PBY Catalinas were flying similar search patterns, each aircraft assigned a sector of ocean to monitor, each crew scanning the empty horizon for signs of the enemy. They had launched before dawn from the Midway Lagoon, their hulls cutting through the dark water before lifting heavily into the air, fuel tanks brimming, bomb bays loaded with depth charges and torpedoes in case they encountered submarines. The patrol plan was comprehensive, methodical, designed to sweep a 700-mile arc northwest of the atoll, where Japanese forces were most likely to approach. It was the kind of operation that required patience, discipline, and an almost mechanical attention to detail qualities not typically celebrated in wartime narratives, but qualities that would prove as tactically decisive as any fighter pilot's reflexes or bombardier's aim. The men who flew these patrols understood that their work was unglamorous. They understood that they would receive little recognition, that the torpedo squadrons and dive bombers would claim the headlines, that history would remember the dramatic strikes and dogfights, while forgetting the hours of tedious searching that made those strikes possible. But they also understood something else, that wars are not won by heroic gestures alone. They are won by information, by logistics, by the grinding, unglamorous work of observation and reconnaissance, by showing up, hour after hour, day after day, and doing the job that needs doing, even when no one is watching. They were not glamorous, but they were essential. The Japanese, by contrast, had made a critical miscalculation in their reconnaissance doctrine. Japanese naval aviation in 1942 was superb in many respects. Their carrier pilots were among the finest in the world, their torpedo bombers devastatingly effective, their Zero fighters superior to almost any opponent they faced. But Japanese reconnaissance was inconsistent, under-resourced, and often treated as an afterthought. On the morning of June 4th, the Japanese scout plane, assigned to search the sector where the American carriers were actually positioned, launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems aboard the cruiser Tone. That 30-minute delay would cascade into disaster. By the time the delayed scout finally reported American carriers in the area, it was too late. Japanese strike aircraft were already committed to attacking Midway, their weapons configured for ground targets rather than ships. The decision to rearm them for naval strike would consume precious time during which American dive bombers, guided by Reed's earlier sighting, would arrive over the Japanese fleet. One scout plane, launching 30 minutes late. One missed reconnaissance sector, the difference between victory and catastrophe. The Americans, meanwhile, had built their entire defensive strategy around information dominance. The story of Midway is often told as a tale of code breaking, and indeed, the American ability to decrypt Japanese naval communications had provided strategic warning that an attack was coming. But intelligence is only valuable if it can be verified and updated in real time. Code breaking told the Americans that Midway would be attacked. It was the PBY Catalinas, flying their grid patterns through the pre-dawn darkness, that told them exactly where the enemy was, exactly when they were coming, and exactly what forces they were bringing. It was scout planes that transformed abstract intelligence into actionable tactical data. And it was scout planes, in the hours that followed Reed's initial contact, that would continue to shadow the Japanese fleet, tracking its movements, reporting changes in course and speed, updating the American task force commanders with a constant stream of information that allowed them to position their strikes with precision. The Catalinas orbited at the edge of visibility, just beyond the range of Japanese fighters, trailing the enemy formation like patient wolves following a herd. They were unarmed for the fight they were observing. They could not engage. They could only watch, report, and survive. But in doing so, they provided the American commanders with something the Japanese never achieved that day: a clear, continuous picture of enemy dispositions. The PBY crews understood the weight of what they were doing. They understood that every position report, every bearing and distance, every update on enemy course and composition fed directly into the decision-making calculus of the admirals commanding the task forces. They understood that their observations would determine when the strike aircraft launched, what routes they would fly, where they would search for targets. They understood that lives, American lives, Japanese lives, the entire outcome of the battle depended on the accuracy of their reports. And so they flew their patterns with obsessive precision, cross-checking landmarks, verifying positions, reporting only what they could confirm with absolute certainty. There was no room for error, no room for assumption, only facts. The Battle of Midway would ultimately be decided not by the scout planes themselves, but by the dive bombers and torpedo planes they guided to their targets. At 1020 hours on June 4th, American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese carrier fleet and delivered the most devastating 5-minute attack in naval history, setting 3 Japanese carriers ablaze and mortally wounding a 4th. The strikes were executed with precision and courage, and the crews who flew them earned every accolade they received. But those strikes happened because Jack Reed and his fellow PBY crews had found the enemy in the darkness, had tracked them through the morning, had provided the coordinates that allowed the strike aircraft to intercept a moving target across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The scout planes had done their job. The fleet had been found. The bombs had been guided home. Victory at Midway is often attributed to American code-breaking, to the courage of the torpedo squadrons, to the skill of the dive bomber pilots, to the decisions of Admirals Spruance and Fletcher. All of these factors were critical. But underpinning all of them was a more fundamental advantage. The Americans knew where the enemy was. The Japanese did not. That asymmetry of information created and maintained by unglamorous patrol planes flying tedious search patterns proved as decisive as any weapon. The PBY Catalina was not a glamorous aircraft. But glamour is not a measure of significance. In the calculus of war, the ability to see is often more valuable than the ability to strike. A bomb can destroy a ship, but knowledge of where that ship is, where it is going, and what it is doing, that knowledge can destroy an entire fleet. Throughout the Pacific War, the pattern would repeat itself. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, American submarines and patrol aircraft provided the early warning that allowed Admiral Mark Mitcher to position his carriers for the devastating Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, in which American fighters annihilated Japanese naval, aviation, in a single day. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, scout planes located and tracked the dispersed Japanese task forces, providing the intelligence that allowed the Americans to coordinate their response to the most complex naval engagement of the war. In the Solomon Islands, along the New Guinea coast, across the vast expanses of the Central Pacific, patrol planes flew their endless searches, mapping enemy positions, tracking convoys, locating airfields, and providing the continuous stream of information that allowed American commanders to plan and execute operations with confidence. The crews of these aircraft did not fire the shots that made headlines. They did not sink battleships or shoot down enemy aces. But they made those victories possible. They were the infrastructure of naval warfare, invisible, essential, and utterly indispensable. The Japanese never fully grasped this principle. Throughout the war, Japanese reconnaissance remained ad hoc and under-resourced. Japanese commanders prioritized offensive striking power over information-gathering capability. Their doctrine emphasized decisive battle and aggressive action, but often failed to ensure that those actions were informed by accurate, timely intelligence. Time and again, Japanese forces would stumble into engagements without knowing the full disposition of enemy forces, while American commanders operated with near-complete situational awareness. The disparity was not primarily one of courage or skill. Japanese pilots and sailors fought with extraordinary determination throughout the war. The disparity was one of doctrine, of institutional priorities, of understanding that information is itself a form of combat power. The Americans, shaped by their own cultural and industrial traditions, understood this instinctively. American military culture in World War II was characterized by an obsessive emphasis on logistics, coordination, and information management. American factories did not just produce more weapons than their adversaries, they produced the infrastructure to employ those weapons effectively. American commanders did not just plan operations, they built the systems to gather, process, and disseminate the intelligence necessary to execute those operations. The PBY Catalina, in this sense, was the perfect embodiment of American military philosophy. Not the most powerful weapon, not the fastest or most deadly, but the tool that made the system work, the aircraft that ensured nothing was left to chance. And there was a deeper symbolism at work as well. The PBY Catalina was a product of Consolidated Aircraft, a company formed through the merger of smaller firms during the 1930s. It was built in factories in San Diego, New Orleans, and later Canada and the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease agreements. It was maintained by crews trained in schools scattered across the United States, from Pensacola to Seattle. It was fueled by oil from Texas and California, armed with ordnance from arsenals in Pennsylvania and Illinois, guided by radios built in New York and New Jersey. It was, in every sense, a product of the vast industrial and logistical apparatus that the United States had built over decades of economic development. An apparatus that Japan, for all its martial prowess, could never hope to match. When Jack Reed spotted the Japanese carriers on the morning of June 4th, 1942, he was not just flying an airplane. He was operating a node in a vast network of industrial production, logistical coordination, training infrastructure, and institutional knowledge that spanned an entire continent. The Japanese carriers he spotted were equally impressive feats of engineering and seamanship, but they were operating in isolation, without the comprehensive support network that underpinned every aspect of American military operations. The battle that followed was not just a contest of ships and planes. It was a contest of systems, and the system that possessed better information, better coordination, and better infrastructure would win. This was the deeper truth that the scout planes represented, that victory in modern war is determined not just by the weapons you bring to the battlefield, but by the infrastructure that allows you to employ those weapons effectively. That courage and skill, while necessary, are not sufficient. That wars are won by the patient, unglamorous work of building systems, gathering information, and ensuring that every action is informed by the best available knowledge. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who fought at Midway were not inferior warriors. They were brave, skilled, and determined, but they were operating within a system that had not prioritized the unglamorous work of reconnaissance and intelligence. They were fighting blind, while their opponents could see, and in war, the blind do not defeat the sighted. In the weeks and months following Midway, the legend of the battle would grow. The torpedo squadrons would be remembered for their suicidal courage. The dive bomber pilots would be celebrated as the men who turned the tide of the Pacific War. Admirals Spruance and Fletcher would be studied as masters of naval tactics. All of this was deserved. But in the official reports, in the after-action analyses filed by the task force commanders, one element appeared again and again: the critical importance of the early morning contact report from Patrol Plane 8P1, piloted by Ensign Jack Reed. That single sighting, made at 05:34 hours on June 4th, 1942, had provided the foundation for everything that followed. They had called it just a scout plane. They had dismissed it as unglamorous, secondary, an auxiliary component of the real fighting force. But when the moment came, when the entire campaign hung in the balance, it was the scout plane that delivered the decisive intelligence. It was the scout plane that guided the bombs into an entire fleet. The PBY Catalinas would continue flying their patrols for the rest of the war. They would rescue downed pilots, hunt submarines, bomb Japanese installations, and conduct countless reconnaissance missions across every theater of the Pacific. Many would be shot down, many crews would be lost, but they would never again have to wonder whether their work mattered. Midway had answered that question definitively. By war's end, American patrol aviation had flown hundreds of thousands of hours of reconnaissance, had charted vast expanses of previously unmapped ocean, had located and tracked thousands of enemy vessels, and had provided the intelligence foundation for virtually every major amphibious landing and carrier strike in the Pacific campaign. The infrastructure they built, the training programs, the maintenance depots, the coordination procedures, the reporting protocols, would become the template for maritime patrol aviation for generations to come. But the true legacy of the scout planes was philosophical rather than technical. They had demonstrated, in the most concrete possible terms, that information is power, that seeing is a weapon, that the unglamorous work of patient observation can be as decisive as any act of heroism, that wars are won not just by brave men in the decisive moment, but by capable men doing necessary work in the long hours when no one is watching. This was a lesson that resonated beyond the specific tactical circumstances of the Pacific War. It spoke to a broader truth about how democracies wage war not through singular genius or martial mystique, but through systematic organization, institutional competence, and the recognition that victory depends on 10,000 unglamorous tasks performed competently and reliably. The American military in World War II was not uniformly superior to its adversaries in every domain, but it excelled at building systems, at coordinating complexity, at ensuring that information flowed where it was needed and that resources were employed efficiently. These were not romantic qualities. They did not inspire poetry or legend. But they won wars. The scout plane, in this sense, was the perfect symbol of American military power. Not the weapon itself, but the system that ensured the weapon would be in the right place at the right time with the right information to strike decisively. It was the embodiment of industrial democracy at war, methodical, patient, comprehensive, and ultimately overwhelming. June 4th, 1942. A date that would live in history as the turning point of the Pacific War. A date remembered for the bravery of torpedo pilots, the skill of dive bombers, the tactical acumen of American admirals, but also, though less celebrated, a date that demonstrated the power of knowledge over ignorance, of preparation over improvisation, of systems over chaos. At 0534 hours, Ensign Jack Reed had keyed his radio transmitter and spoken 5 words. Enemy carriers. Bearing 320, distance 180. Those words had travelled across hundreds of miles of empty ocean, had reached the American task forces, had been processed and analysed and transformed into operational orders. And 4 hours later, American bombs had fallen through clear Pacific sky and struck 3 Japanese carriers within the span of 5 minutes, turning the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Aviation Corps into funeral pyres visible from 30 miles away. They had called it just a scout plane. They had been wrong. It was the instrument that made victory possible, the eyes that guided the sword, the proof that in modern war, knowledge is the ultimate weapon, and those who possess it will guide bombs into entire fleets, while those who lack it sail blindly toward their doom. The sun rose higher over the Pacific on that June morning in 1942. The battle would rage for 2 more days. More men would die, more ships would burn, more heroism would be displayed on both sides. But the decisive moment had already passed, had occurred in the pre-dawn darkness, when a tired ensign in an unglamorous patrol plane had squinted through plexiglass at a smudge on the horizon and recognized it for what it was. The enemy, caught unaware, positioned perfectly for destruction. The scout plane turned slowly, keeping the enemy fleet at the edge of visibility, and continued its patient watch. There was no glory in this moment, no dramatic action, no story that would be told around firesides or commemorated in monuments. There was only duty, competently performed, information, accurately reported, knowledge, transformed into power, and in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.